Today's horror story is written by C Neighbor 7621. The doctor removed his jacket and placed it upon its hanger. His suit was always in pristine condition and elegantly outlined his slim figure. Where he had gotten such clothing, I will never know, but the vividness of the black satin would stand out on the blackest nights. He had asked me to be his assistant a few weeks back and has taught me a great many things during my internship. Everything from types of surgical tools to the effects certain chemicals have on the body. "Did you gather the last subject as I asked, Nathan?" questioned Dr. Wallace. "Yes, doctor. It's in the room with the others," I responded. "Excellent. Let us prepare for our final meeting together. Run upstairs and clean up, then join me in the operating room." "Yes, sir." I was quite disheartened to know this would be our last day working together. He was an excellent employer for someone so young. We were the same age of 25, and none would guess by his demeanor. The way he presented himself and how he spoke to others always had a sort of power over them. No matter their stature or position in society, if a person was addressed by Dr. Wallace, they would speak as if they spoke to royalty. He never commanded such respect, but it was always given as though people were terrified of him. This had always bothered me throughout our time together because the man I knew had no reason to be feared. He was a man of science and worked to better our medical knowledge for the good of man. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard him call out, "Nathan, you remember the formula, right?" "Yes, I'm not that much of an imbecilic that I'd forget 4 simple lines," I responded in a joking manner. "Ha ha ha ha. Hurry up then. We've work to do." He sounded so joyful today. I couldn't blame him in the slightest. After all, we had spent weeks preparing for tonight, and all of our work was about to pay off. I would be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed, though. I had grown quite fond of working with him, and to think after today we would no longer work together saddened me. But his work was vastly more important. I quickly walked to the shower and began washing myself thoroughly. I should recite the formula, I thought to myself. 7, 6, 2, and 1, I said aloud. It wasn't as complex as most formulas the doctor had shown me, but it was of greater importance by far. I quickly finished cleaning myself and headed towards the basement. After tonight, the whole world would know how great Dr. Wallace was. There was little doubt of that in my mind. Today would go down as the greatest day in human history. The basement had always struck me as odd until I learned its purpose. It looked far older than the newly refurbished Georgian home. It looked the same as I imagined an ancient castle's basement would look. Large stone brick walls, the same as the floor, with slots to hold torches or candles throughout. Which seems trivial in today's electric era, but the doctor always preferred the light of fire over that of incandescent bulbs. Fire has life in it. It has soul, unlike those glass bulbs, he would often say. Each of the walls bore a solid metal door that led to its own room, and in the middle of the basement there was a stone circle made of 4 layers, each a level below the previous. The first circle was made of 7 equal stones, the second 6, then 2, and finally the last was a solid circle. This was the most crucial part of our work. Without it, none of this could be possible. "Are you ready?" the doctor asked in a monotone voice. He was wearing a mask now. It was made of white cloth and covered every inch of skin from his shirt collar up. The seams ran along the carotid arteries, up the face and through the middle of the eye holes. A thin smile had been cut where the mouth was, and both it and the eyes were blacker than the abyss. Along with his vest and slacks against his white shirt, he looked menacingly horrifying. "Absolutely. I'll bring the first group in." I went to the door on the north wall and began to unlatch it. 7 sinners, to be impaled and bled dry, I whispered to myself. I opened the door and grabbed the torch off the wall, shining my way into the room. These filthy sinners were the first subjects the doctor had me retrieve. I didn't care to learn their names, only their sins. Each of them represented one of the 7 deadly sins. They all shared a muffled scream and thrashed about. I went to the first. He was pride. His piercing eyes gazed into mine, but he did not fight back. He was better than that, after all. I hooked his bindings to a hook that hung from the ceiling and proceeded to fetch the rest. Wrath fought like his life depended on it, as expected. The whore, Lust, had the audacity to try at seduction, but was met only with having his tongue cut out. The rest took very little time to get out, except for gluttony. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I had to have Dr. Wallace assist me with hoisting him up. They all hung from their chains, flailing about like newly caught fish, with fear in their eyes for what was to come. I went back to the edge of their room to retrieve 7 wooden pikes, each approximately 8 feet in length, topped with a stone spear point. Beginning with the fat slob, I took the first spear and placed it at his feet. Quickly, I realized I would require a stepping stool for this next task. Looking around, all I could see was an old wooden chair near the base of the staircase. Swiftly, I retrieved it and placed it in front of the whale. I grabbed the spear and stepped onto the chair, placing the stone's tip against his manubrium. Slowly, I forced the point into his flesh. His screams filled the basement walls, the cries of the others begging reverberating in the air. Approximately halfway through his body, his screams turned to gasps, gurgling through the blood filling his throat. It took longer than I had expected, but once the stone spear had pierced through the skin at the base of his tailbone, the wooden handle glided with ease until it struck the floor. The remaining 6, crying, except for Pride. He looked broken, as though his mind finally realized there was no way out of this. Taking my time, I visited them one by one, repeating the process over and over, each begging constantly for me to stop till the spears pierced their lungs, removing the air from their bodies, drowning in their own blood. Little did they know they were the lucky ones. Their deaths were swift compared to what was to come. 6 false prophets, crucified and filled with iron. I walked to the southern room and threw open the door. There sat 6 pastors who had lied and cheated their congregations, stolen from their followers and preyed on their fears. I only knew one, Father Jacob. I chose him specifically for this. For too long had he tortured the youth of the town, telling them it was a mortal sin to deny the leader of their church or to discuss what happened in his house of God. He was to be the first. We had gathered these 6 weeks prior to tonight, so they were already weak from partial starvation. I undid Father Jacob's shackles and kicked him in the ribs as he fell to the ground. Anger flooded my mind, and in a fit of rage I resumed kicking him until I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. "We need him, Nathan. Calm yourself," the kind doctor whispered from the shadowed mask. "He'll get what's coming to him soon enough." "My apologies, doctor. I didn't know what came over me." I grabbed the man by his hair and dragged him out of the room. He was praying with such vigor it sounded as if a man who had just witnessed the face of God was reciting it. The doctor had already retrieved one of the metallic crosses that laid flat on its placement. It stood the same height as the wooden pikes, 6 inches wide all around. Thin razors lined the front of the cross, with 2 slightly curved spikes where the hands were to be placed. Making sure to do it as slowly as I was able, I pulled Jacobs across the blades and positioned him in the proper manner. His agony brought me great joy, as it mirrored the pain he had wrought onto others. I took his left hand and placed it atop of one of the spikes and applied just enough pressure to allow it to break through the skin. Little by little, the spike stretched an ever-growing hole in his hand. Tears flowed from his face, Apologies filled his every word. He pleaded for forgiveness, just as I had all those years ago. "Go fetch the iron. I'll finish this," the doctor said with the faintest sound of hatred ringing in his voice. I stood and walked swiftly up the stairs to the stove. On it there was a pot made of strange metal. No matter how much heat you applied, it would always remain cold. Its color was also a mystery. It was gold, yet it was silver, and wherever the light struck it, it would shine a sickly green color. As I picked the pot up, I heard a gut-wrenching scream, one of pure terror. It was the father's voice, so I felt no concern or remorse. I carefully walked the pot of molten metal down the stairs, where I saw the weeping holy man pleading with his God to save him. His voice falling on deaf ears, because tonight his God had abandoned him. The doctor took the pot from my hands and told the pitiful man to open his mouth. Tears flowed down his face, his breath gasping between sobs as he slowly opened his mouth. Dr. Wallace tipped the container slightly, and the molten metal and slag flowed into Father Jacobs' mouth, rushing into his body as it burned through all it touched. His eyes screamed to be put out of his misery. As the light faded from his eyes, we hoisted the cross upwards to the slot on the second stone ring, and then I went to replace the missing iron in the pot while the doctor began the preparations on the next subject. It took us less time than I had expected to finish with the rest of the 6. None fought more than a little, as though they accepted their fates. Perhaps it was the starvation that added in that, but I was relieved. This night had taken its toll on me already, but we were almost finished, so my motivation would carry me through the rest. 2 brides, flayed and fed to the hive, I said as I walked to the eastern doorway. This room held Marjorie and Gwen. They were not like the others. They knew their purpose and intended to follow through with it. They had been with Dr. Wallace since the beginning of his plan and had even assisted in acquiring a few of the former subjects. They were a lovely couple who had always been kind to me. Their relationship to one another had always been frowned upon by the townsfolk, but I could care less. They had purpose, and that was all that mattered. When I opened the door, they were holding each other, embracing one final time, I suppose. Gwen was the first to notice me, and as she did, she leaned forward to kiss Marjorie. "Is it time already?" Marjorie asked. "Yes. Please go to your positions," I stated in a melancholy tone. Though I would see them again, the knowledge didn't lighten the weight of what was to come. As they stood, each of them removed their clothing and picked up a small knife. These knives were made from the same material as the pot, but far more detailed. Images of great, horrible things covered the handles. Things I could not even dream of. Something about these tools sent shudders up my spine. The women walked to Dr. Wallace, who was holding a small glass in each hand. They each took one and quickly drank their contents, then proceeded through the impaled sinners and crucified prophets to their circle. Once across from one another, they leaned over and began dragging the blades along the sides of their bodies, starting at their ankles and working their way up, cutting and peeling away their own skin, each cut making them scream out in pleasure as they removed more and more flesh. Careful not to sever any tendons or muscles, they expertly skinned their bodies. It was such a beautiful sight. These 2 women sharing one final moment together, doing their part to fulfill the doctor's plan. As they reached their faces, the doctor handed me a large jar full of small cylindrical beetles and picked one up for himself. I carried the jar over to Marjorie. As her lipless mouth smiled at me, I emptied the jar over her fleshless head. The look in her eyes lit up with pure bliss as the strange insects began devouring her. I then returned to the outside of the circle as the two magnificent girls were consumed down to the bone, their skeletons held upright by the remaining tendons. "Now, for the final part," I heard the doctor speak behind me. "One fool to bear the gate." As the words left his mouth, I felt a sharp pain at the side of my neck. And as I turned to look at Dr. Wallace's face, my vision began to fail me, his menacing mask peering into my soul. I awoke to find myself strung over a wooden block. It was strangely yellowed in a malicious way, and it seemed to have grown over my arms to restrain me. It was difficult to breathe, as though someone was squeezing the air from my lungs, my back searing with pain as if all my ribs had been broken. I slowly looked up to see a black wall, its shade rivaled only by the depths of space. In front of it stood Dr. Wallace, his arms outstretched as he laughed successfully. Our night was victorious. We had opened the doorway, and all of our work had paid off. He turned to look at me, and as he did, I smiled. "Thank you, Nathan, for everything." As he said that, he turned and walked through the door. While my vision faded and I drew my last breath, only one thought crossed my mind. Praise the unseen.